Those of you up on stage, just grab headphones from here so you don't have to sit on them. Picking some of those, yeah. All right, good afternoon. My name is Lloyd Day. I'm the Deputy Director General of ECA. Welcome back to the home of sustainable agriculture of the Americas. Today, we're going to talk about from pasture to plate, livestock's role in the evolving carbon voluntary market. We talked about this last year at our at the COP29. We had the ministers of agriculture and a variety of carbon market experts, and I think they left more confused than they arrived. So I'm very hopeful with the executive director of the Global Roundtable of Sustainable Beef. We're going to be able to figure this all out. I'd like to thank Elanco for this concept of this panel and for being a good friend of ECA's for many years and for helping also be a sponsor of this pavilion. So with that, the Executive Director of GRSB, Rory Peter.
Thank you, Lloyd. And thanks everybody for coming today. It's a pleasure to be here in Baku. You want those? Righto. So just to clarify, in case Lloyd gave you the impression that I know anything about Article 6, I don't. So if you have questions about Article 6, and particularly the details under 6.2 and 6.4, I will not be fielding them. And Colin South in the audience might know more than anybody up here. So I can give you a very brief overview of those things. Basically, 6.4 seems to have been approved now. 6.4 is the mechanism that allows countries to decide how they account for their credits. And 6.2 is the mechanism which will allow them to trade across borders. So 6.4 has passed, 6.2 still some discussion it seems. But that's the extent of my knowledge. Right, so farmers have got a number of tools that they can use to mitigate emissions. Agriculture as a whole is one of the few sectors that can genuinely remove carbon from the atmosphere. So we have enormous potential in our sector to actually make a difference. Whereas many other sectors, they can reduce emissions. They're not really going to actually take anything out of the atmosphere. The other thing that we can do is reduce methane, and that has an immediate, well, very rapid cooling effect because methane is a short-lived climate pollutant. So if you can reduce methane, you can actually, for your part of the warming, you can actually create negative warming or cooling. It's a little bit misleading to say cooling because obviously everybody else is still emitting, so the overall balance will still be going up, but we can diminish our contribution to warming through agriculture and particularly through carbon sequestration. We've got a number of experts here from the livestock sector, and that's what we're talking about. Livestock obviously is one of the major sources of methane emissions, and therefore a huge potential for mitigation, because if we can reduce those methane emissions and if we can also sequester carbon, we can have a genuine impact on climate. And therefore, I feel, and we all feel, that the livestock sector is well poised to take advantage of carbon markets. So at the moment, there are some countries where we're seeing signals from the market, where we're seeing actual credits and trading and income to producers, but it's by no means everywhere. And what we're going to dive into today is what these people in their different countries and sectors are seeing developing and what the future might look like. But I think the future for livestock as a whole and for agriculture should look rosy, and we just need to make sure that we keep agriculture in the picture of all of the COPs. I think it's disappointing that agriculture is not a mainstream part of the agenda. Like, given that we are the sector that can mitigate and can genuinely draw carbon down, but also we're the sector that's most impacted by climate change and the sector that gives everybody breakfast, lunch, and dinner, you know, agriculture should be the center of COP. It shouldn't be something on the margins where we're starting every couple of years a new process to just make sure we can hang on to the coattails of everybody else. And the same goes for climate finance. Agriculture receives the least of all sectors in terms of climate finance. It should be receiving the most. Like, without agriculture, nobody's going to be eating. So we should be really much bigger in COP than we currently are. So I'd like to invite first Katie Clark, Vice President of Food Animals at Elanco Animal Health. We were going to invite her up to the stage. She's already on the stage. So Katie, welcome, and thanks for joining us. I'm going to ask you a question, then I'll introduce the others as I ask each of them their first question as well. So the voluntary carbon markets can play an important role to connect farms with food companies further up the chain. But how far are we in doing that so far? I mean, we hear a lot of talk about that, and people say, oh yeah, the farmers are going to be rewarded. Are they actually being rewarded yet? And how widespread is that? And how much is that helping food companies?
It's a really good question. I'm going to take these off. And thanks for having me here. So for those of you that don't know, Elanco Animal Health is an animal health company that's been in the industry for over 70 years. For the first 70 years, right, we spent a lot of time around making sure that we provided products that helped animals be healthier, improved animal welfare, and really over the past several years have really leaned into sustainability and helping ranchers and farmers really reduce their carbon footprint on farm. So one of the things that you asked is like, okay, so what's happening in that space? What does that look like? And what I'm really excited to share is we're seeing a lot of progress, particularly in the United States with the teams that we're working with. And there's several members actually here in the audience that are participating in some of the voluntary carbon markets. So if you don't mind, I might actually run us through a couple of slides just to show you guys what's actually happening in particularly the dairy and beef sectors in the United States when we think about the opportunity for producers to not only reduce their emissions, but also receive incentives both from the private market, but also the public, where we have a private-public partnership with the USDA as well as member food companies.
Yeah, that was helpful.
Is it? All right, so we'll go ahead and switch, if we can switch slides. Okay, so just to give you guys a little bit of grounding as we think about what we're doing from an Elanco perspective and what we think is really important when we partner with not just producers, but also the food companies is how do we connect that value chain? And when we connect the value chain, there's 4 key areas that we think about. So one is, what is the innovation or the intervention that we bring that can actually reduce the carbon footprint? The second one is, how do we help producers measure the impact that they're having on the environment, and also be able to report that into the food chain so they can actually quantify the reductions that are being made. The third part is really important, is around the value creation, and this is where we see the public-private partnership really playing out. There's an organization called Athian in the United States, which is the first livestock insetting carbon marketplace, and I want to emphasize insetting carbon marketplace versus an offset marketplace that we've established in the United States. Where we're actually starting to monetize carbon today. The other part of that equation is obviously the U.S. government, and so we're excited to share that in the U.S., the USDA has provided almost $200 million in government grants for feed ingredients for beef and dairy producers to reduce their carbon emissions. And then the other part is advocacy. Honestly, it's part of why we're here, is really how do we tell the story for our farmers? How do we make sure that not only are we telling the story, but we're making sure that farmers, whether it's farmers in the United States or small farmers in other countries, have access to these technologies that they can actually implement. So if we go to the next slide, I'll walk you through actually what this looks like. And it looks crazy busy, so I'll do a kind of a high level of what it looks like. So if you look to the left side, what's in the navy blue is really your traditional value stream. So farmers every day, right, we produce food. So we typically, it's whether it's meat, milk, or eggs, you produce the food, it goes to a processor of some type, that processor then sells it to the food companies. What we're advocating for is actually an alternative income stream for the producer. So what we're saying is actually how do we separate the meat, milk, and eggs from the carbon and provide on a producer's income stream that they're getting paid per hundredweight of milk or whatever it may be on the meat side, in the milk side, but then they get a per metric ton of CO2 equivalent paycheck that they're getting as well. And that's really what's on the right side of the equation. So I'll walk you through 2 interventions today that we're actually monetizing in the U.S. So I actually have a partner from DFA here in the audience, and I'm happy to announce earlier this year they did purchase the first carbon credits, inset carbon credits from dairy producers in the U.S. for rumensin. And we're actively in the process of also building credits for Bovaer, which will be coming here and cutting producers' checks by the end of the year. So I'll walk you through what does that look like. So Bovaer is a feed ingredient, for those that you are not aware, that reduces methane by about 30% to lactating dairy cows. So that's about 1.2 metric tons of CO2 emissions reduction in the US based on what our average cows consume. So if I'm a farmer, I go and I buy feed like I normally do. This is the great thing about feed ingredients, is they're not capital intensive, they're easy to add, they're already feeding the cows every day, they're going to the feed mill, getting that feed. You add Bovaer in, you feed the cow once a day, less than a tablespoon of the product a day, and then you're reducing your emissions. So the producer does that. The other part that we have is a tool called Uplook. So we're on farm already, collecting a lot of their data and helping them make production decisions. Now we're also collecting additional data around their carbon footprint. And so what we do is understand how many cows did they feed, what were they consuming, what was the dose of Bovaer, all of those things to actually help them say, okay, here's the carbon footprint reduction for feeding Bovaer on farm. So once we have that data from them, the Uplook data, we send it then to Athian, right? So that is the carbon insetting marketplace. So with the agreement of the farmer and the data sharing agreements that we have, we pass along only the reduction that is being made on farm, so they can actually create a verified carbon credit. So what they're doing is bringing all of those and aggregating the credits together, and then they're actually going on farm and providing third-party verification of the credits on farm. They then connect them to the food companies. So this is where you see the Nestle's, Danone's, Mars, Starbucks, all of those different types of companies. And what I can actually tell you is we have several food companies who have signed contracts with Athian to buy both Bovaer and Rumensin credits today. And what they do then is buy those carbon credits from Athian, and then Athian then cuts a check back to the producer. So that's one part of the value stream. The other part you'll see up there is the government incentives. So we're excited to share, like I mentioned, that we have about $200 million in USDA grants. And what we've done is we've partnered actually with a lot of our lead partners, our processors and other NGO groups that are helping us and helping the farmers incentivize that. And so they also then receive a check for those USDA grants, and it's about a 50-50 split right now. 50% coming from public dollars and 50% coming from private funding. So what I'm really excited about is this is actually happening. We are scaling it in the U.S. We anticipate having more than 100,000 cows on Bovaer by the end of the year, and being able to mint these carbon credits and selling them to multiple offtake partners or those food companies. So from a food company standpoint, I think was your third question, how are we helping them? They're looking for ways to get on farm, right? They don't have sales teams like we do at Elanco that are calling on these farmers day in and day out, or processors like DFA and others. And so what we've been able to do is create a partnership where we can help them on farm, collect that data, and give them really transparent, credible, and verified credits that allow them to speak with confidence around the Scope 3 commitments that they've made.
Great stuff. We'll come back to you for sure. There's plenty to talk about in what you just described. I think it's interesting that the model you're talking about, particularly, I guess for people who think about cattle production, I guess the bucolic image we often have is of cattle out on the range grazing grasslands, and of course all cattle start like that. Certainly beef cattle do, dairy cattle a little bit different, but beef cattle all start out on the range, and it's harder to reach them with these kind of technologies. And we're definitely hoping that within the next couple of years we'll have a rumen vaccine which will enable us to vaccinate cattle against enteric methane emissions. That is already well under development, and we really hope that it becomes a viable option in the next couple of years. Anyway, I'm going to move on now, introduce Gilles Froment. He's the president of the International Dairy Federation. I got a similar question to you. You're working obviously deeply in the dairy industry, and are dairy farmers working directly with those upstream companies, whoever it might be, Danone, Arla, Parmalat, these kind of companies, and are they getting credits? Are they getting paid for carbon reductions?
I think it. Okay, I think it will depend on the company. So I just got in my role a month ago, and I'm not that well versed in the carbon market, of course. And this is not a topic that we've discussed that much at IDF so far. but if you go back, I'll take a step back. You look at the milk payment systems. We went from, lots of milk around the world that was paid on a volume basis to component to remunerating fat and protein and so on, to payment on quality, payment based on food safety and those kind of things. So now I think we're at that next step of looking at how do you generate, like you said, a revenue stream and what will be the measures that will guide this revenue stream. So I think it's important that no matter what system we adopt, and it's important that we have, hopefully, I would promote that we have a global system that's very similar, but I know it's not going to happen because certain companies, certain co-ops, certain buyers will want to do their own, will want to take their own approach to remunerating. The country I come in, Canada, price is regulated, so farmers have to work together, and we will need a system where it will apply pretty much equally to everyone. So it's not like I can go as Lactalis and say, I'm going to give you a premium, and my competitor does another one, and so on. So that's that market. The other thing I think that's important to, from my perspective, is we need to be able to make sure that these in-setting credits remain as much as possible within our value chain. And I'm talking dairy here.
Yeah.
Our beef maybe and livestock may be the same as well. Because I'm really concerned that if we're not fast enough to develop that system moving forward and provide that remuneration, whatever it is, or incentive, farmers may be tempted to sell credit outside, to oil companies or to other that are willing to pay maybe more for those valuable credits. So, and in my view, if this has happened on a large scale, then what's happening in the end is we're shooting ourselves in the foot as an industry moving forward.
Yeah.
So,
I think Katie made that point as well. If we're going to make a difference in agriculture, we also need to claim that difference. We need to make it clear that this is something agriculture has done, and if you've reduced the footprint of the milk or the beef or the pork or whatever it may be, that is where it stays. And of course, farmers need freedom of choice. I'm not suggesting it's compulsory, but it is much to the industry's benefit if we make it work for farmers ourselves, rather than just allowing another company who isn't actually reducing emissions to come in and pay for the benefits. That, to my mind, is just a form of greenwashing.
May I add a little something? The other thing I think that's important, representing, a global dairy industry, is that not all farms are made the same. So we're talking about the farm model in the U.S., but you talk about, smallholder farms in India or in Africa or in other areas. So the tool may not be all the same. So I don't think it's going to be one size fit all around the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And talking of around the world, we'll move on to Gonzalo Baconia, who is from the Ministry of Livestock, Agriculture and Fisheries in Uruguay. He's involved in the negotiations. He just sprinted here, so he's getting fit during COP, which is great. Gonzalo, I know that farmers in Uruguay are using ISO certification to demonstrate net zero, and there are producers who are selling zero carbon beef out of Uruguay. But I was wondering if you could talk about how that contributes to Uruguay's nationally determined contributions, and how do you balance that between what the supply chain is buying and what the country has committed to?
Well, it's a big question. Yeah. Thank you, Rory, for the question. In Uruguay, I mean, we are talking about carbon credits and different instruments, and we know that they are not silver bullets for promote climate action in farmers. In Uruguay, we work very close to the NDCs because we believe that the NDCs are the main strategies of the country, and is the first of all that is the place where you join the private and the public sector to work together in a roadmap of actions in the whole country regarding livestock sector mainly, but the whole agriculture sector. So that's the first point. And in that case, I mean, Uruguay have explored different kind, as you said, some farmers, but it was really an innovation instrument that some farmers use it, but it was really complicated at the end to validate that neutral carbon of that emissions. So I know two or three cases. In some cases, they buy some carbon credits to demonstrate it. In one case, what was one industry, and some other that did it, but was only a big farm. So because they have the complete cycle, so they can do it, and they have the enough forest land to demonstrate the sequestration. So it's an instrument, but at the end, I don't know if they get an incentive in price to do that things. So there was an opportunity. It's a really small market, and probably they could earn some money. Otherwise, they don't do it. But I mean, but when we think about from a government perspective, we need to think a global solution for all the farmers, and not only for small farmers or some type of farmers. So that's why we explore in Uruguay other instrument that is working with showing our achievements in our objectives in our NDCs. That's why if we want to have more financial support for our sector, we need to prove that we are achieving our NDC goals. That's why in our NDC goals are mainly related to reduce emissions, each emissions of each gases, and also to reduce our intensity of our emissions. So I don't know how many countries has this type of goals, but Uruguay has one to reduce. I mean, for 2030, in our second NDCs, to reduce 35% of our net emission, I mean, intensity of our emissions of methane, and 36% of nitrous oxide emissions. So that's a really commitment to what we want to our countries, because we have a stable stock in the country. So our strategy is to work in how we are going to increase the efficiency of the system. We need to we keep on the idea that we need to work also in food security. I mean, we need to reduce emissions, or at least reduce or try to mitigate, but also thinking that we need to keep on producing food for the world.
Absolutely. I'll move on to Donald Moore next. Donald is the Executive Director of the Global Dairy Platform. Donald, what are you seeing? Are you seeing benefits to producers already in the dairy industry? Is that happening already? And is it happening in different countries, or are there specific countries where you've seen more movement than others?
Yeah, am I on?
Yes.
Great. Within the Global Dairy Platform, and actually in partnership with IDF and SAI and a number of other organizations, we launched a program several years ago now called Pathways to Dairy Net Zero, which was looking at how can we reduce emissions from the dairy sector globally. And we know from studies that were conducted by FAO a number of years ago on our behalf that around 80% of the emissions from the dairy sector are coming from emerging markets, developing dairy economies, not from the traditional sort of, developed dairy world of North America, Western Europe, Oceania, and North Asia. So in this Pathways to Dairy Net Zero program, there are two approaches that we are taking towards this topic. In the more developed world, virtually every major dairy company and most of the buyers have made commitments under science-based targets. And if you look at the commitments they've made by and large, they've committed to somewhere between 27 and 33% reduction in Scope 3 emissions, which are the farm-based emissions, by 2030. So we're in that range. So one of the things that the dairy companies are very interested in doing is making sure that we have a model that allows us to measure and validate the emissions reductions inside a value chain. So some people have been calling it insetting. I think there are other connotations to the word insetting, but that concept of how do we retain emissions within the value chain. Now, if you've made a commitment to science-based targets, you're required to use the greenhouse gas protocol for your reporting. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol 2 years ago came out with a set of what they call land sector removals guidance. Hopefully they're going to come out with the final version of it in first quarter next year. But even in that final version, they're not going to get down to the degree of specificity we think we need to have in a commodity agriculture where you aggregate, product at the farm level, multiple farms together in order to process it. And so we've just made a decision within the dairy sector to embark upon a piece of work to develop what we're calling mass balanced chain of custody guidelines that will allow us to maintain a methodology that allows us to maintain integrity of those emissions reductions inside the value chain. And when they're in the value chain, whether the dairy farm can claim them, the processor can claim them, the end customer can claim them. So that's kind of the approach being taken mostly in the developed dairy world. If you go to emerging markets where 80% of the emissions are coming from, there is not that same pressure being placed inside the value chain. And so there you run into probably more of what you've got on the screen here, the concept of the voluntary carbon market, or indeed a number of countries have got compliance markets in place. And there we're doing a piece of work. We've just been commissioned by the Gates Foundation to investigate how we can unlock the potential of carbon markets for livestock, not just for dairy, but for livestock more generally. And if you look around the world at the projects that have been done in carbon markets to date in livestock, they are nearly all land-based services, so carbon sequestration or growing trees on land. The potential, though, for the livestock sector is really in the invisible gas component, reducing emissions of gases. We ran our first meeting as part of this program in Nairobi a couple of weeks ago now on Friday the 8th of November, and we had some analysis done in advance of that. And the potential for sub-Saharan Africa alone of this emissions reduction potential, if you value them at about $50 a ton for carbon, is $4.5 billion annually by 2030 for just the dairy sector, let alone the other sectors. So there's an enormous potential there for increased income for farmers if we can find the triggers to unlock that potential. And so are farmers benefiting? I think there is the potential for them to benefit. There are certainly some specific examples, and I know there are methodologies that operate in more the developed world. There's a VM31, I think it is, which allows you to receive credits against methane reduction using either a product like Bovaer or a digester. But those don't exist in the most of the world yet. And so we're looking for what sort of methodology do we need to have that will allow us to verify emissions reductions in a more extensive system.
Mm-hmm. That's, I'm sure a lot of people will be very happy with a price of $50 a ton. But that does make me ask the question, how much does it actually cost to generate a ton of carbon savings? Like I've heard from various sources that agriculture could be the cheapest way of mitigating carbon. And I'm wondering if any of you have looked into what is the cost of actually mitigating carbon through your different sectors. Has any of you done that?
I assume you did.
It's more than $50. Yes. So I think the way that we're looking at it really depends on the intervention, right? So some interventions have co-benefits, right? Other productivity benefits that producers are getting that offset the cost of the intervention alone. And others so that would be like Rumensin as an example, right? Has a feed efficiency response and other things that are happening there that allow the producer to implement that product, but then we also get the benefit of methane reduction. When you get into things like Bovaer, which is just for methane and doesn't have any co-benefits, then that is a bit more costly, and that's where you have to look at how do you pass that through, and it is more than $50 a ton. And candidly, that's why we have the private-public partnership. So as these innovations are coming to market, right, we don't have the manufacturing, we don't have the scale yet. And so really getting, for us, it was the USDA, but I know there's other opportunities in other markets as well. Getting them at the table and doing that 50-50 partnership with the private and public sector is allowing our producers to get in there, to get the data going, to show that we prove out the model as we build manufacturing plants, as we scale and are able to drive those costs down. But it's more than $50 per metric ton.
Donald's got a point to add there, and then I'll come back to you, Katie.
Yeah, I think in some of the technical innovations, such as Bovair and so on, you're going to be up more than $50 a tonne. And then, of course, you've also got the issue, which is for every carbon credit, how much of that actually ends up in the hands of the farmer. And, how many snouts are in the trough before the money gets to the farmer is one of the key challenges, I think. In some of the pilots we've done in East Africa, where we're looking more at the reductions in emission intensity and whether we can find a way to value those, there is the potential for us to reduce emissions by up to as much as 40% by practice change, which does pay for itself. And if in addition to that practice change, where we can get that reduction in emissions, we've also increased productivity, it will pay for itself. And so the carbon credit would then be an addition on the top of that. But the challenge is going to be in the cost of the verification process, et cetera. And for smallholder farmers, we've either got to find a different way to do this, or we've got to find a way to aggregate them. Now, whether it's aggregating them in sort of the traditional co-op type model or something, but I think there's a way to do it, and I think it does actually pay for itself at $50 a ton. But as I say, the challenge is how much of that money ends up in the hands of the farmer versus versus the industry we're creating of reporting and verification. Yeah. We should be driving for an industry about emissions reductions. Right at the moment, we're creating an industry of verification and reporting.
Right. Now, if I think back to the report that FAO put out at COP last year around mitigating emissions from the livestock sector, there were a range of solutions. So these tools that you've talked about today, Rumensin and Bovair, are one of the things in that list, but there were several, like genetics was significant. You could gain 30% in terms of intensity there. There was animal health, the stuff that we know how to do it already. It's not rocket science, it's not new and shiny, but it's huge in continents like Africa and Asia, where very few of the cattle are being vaccinated in the way that they should be, and diseases are being left untreated. If you've got a cow who's having a calf every 4 years, she is super inefficient. She is not really contributing to the food supply chain, and yet she's continuing to emit methane. So the savings there could be even greater. Katie, do you want to talk about other tools and then we'll go back to Gonzalo?
Yeah, I think we mentioned a few of the tools around animal health, right? So as I look at it, I think we've talked a lot about, and I've showed a lot of examples in the U.S., a very developed market. But as we look at it, Elanco's in over 100 different countries, and it's really how do we think about animal health collectively for those emerging markets. And even honestly, in some places in the U.S., I grew up on a cow-calf operation, and vaccination isn't necessarily a standard practice for all of U.S. farmers. Less than 10% of the U.S. beef herd gets an ionophore today. So I would say that there's even an opportunity in those small farms in our developed markets as well to expand those practices. But it's vaccines, parasiticides, other productivity tools that they have at their hands that they can certainly use. We're actually working on a few projects in the U.S. on the beef side as well as the poultry side and helping those producers measure those just basic production systems. It's not Bovair or anything like that around the other animal health technologies and measuring their emissions reduction and taking that to some other markets. So for me, I think it's how do we get access to those products in those emerging markets. I know as an animal health company, sometimes it's very arduous to get in there, right? So there's not the policies, there's not the ability to manufacture. So how do we get policy that allows us to access those markets and get those products to those farmers? And then the second part is really in those more developed and sophisticated operations. They've implemented a lot of the animal health solutions, and now they're fine-tuning. It's how do you continue to find things like Bovair and other feed ingredients, methane digesters. I think there's a lot of things that those producers can add value to as we think about giving them the tools. And that really comes down to having the public-private partnership, and whether it's starting the producer so that there is actually a financial incentive at the end of the day, or even the innovation companies on being able to get those products to market and bring them.
Right. Gonzalo,
Yes. No, I want to add something of the comments. Because we need to be clear that if we want to go to the voluntary carbon market, you need to create the additionality. It's not like I have my farm and I'm sequestrating carbon, come and give me my certified. So it's more complex than that. What we saw in Uruguay is that each of companies that comes and want to work with carbon credits said, well, which is the additionality that you are going to do in your farm? And then we start thinking the possibility that you have. So I think that it's a solution, but it needs to be to take it easy. I mean, because they took so many troubles to do it, and I agree with the point that already was saying. From Donald is that really, because when we start talking this kind of aspect in Uruguay, there is a company that starts the process. They need to go to accreditate the option that the management that you are doing that really is sequestrating carbon, then to validate it, and at the end they said, well, I will leave you 30% of the credit for the farmer. That is what's happening in Uruguay. Because we need to divide what we are going to earn from the credit.
Right.
So at the end the farmer said, so I'm going to make all this change only for 30% of the credit, because from the $50, she's going to get less than 15 or 15 at least.
Right.
And when you have you see a solution like is agroforestry, for example, that probably is the one that you can capture more carbon. You can get the credit after 8 years, when you really see that the tree is there. Otherwise, it's very complicated. So I mean, not going down with the carbon credit, but we need to involucrate more people in this process.
Right.
I mean, the whole value chain. I mean, this needs to be a process that we need to find someone that really is going to pay more for farmers that they're producing, taking care of the environment. So we need to include more actors in these discussions, not only farmers and probably companies. Probably the consumers need to be also part of this discussion.
Right. But so in Uruguay, you've been through some sort of fairly rapid changes. I saw just between the first time I went to Uruguay in 2011 and this past year, I've been a couple of times. The entire herd has changed color. It was Hereford in 2011. It's now mostly Angus. So clearly farmers can change when they think there's a reason to change. Are there other technologies that farmers have been adopting? We heard a few mentioned. There are the sort of new ones like the feed additives and so on, but there's also just animal health. Is animal husbandry, are those things also changing in Uruguay? Have we moved forward?
Thank you for the question, because the other day we've been in another panel talking about animal health, and I think it's crucial also for many countries. I mean, we have a special objective in our new NDC that is related to animal health, because we know that we have a potential there to reduce intensity of emissions. We have a really potential, but the key issue is that we've been discussing is we need to develop the baseline, because we know what the problems that they cause each of the diseases, but it's difficult to put it all together in a map, which is the baseline, which is causing most problem in our country.
Right.
So the issue is to make a good baseline, and then how you're going to monitor the evolution of the animal health. So that's a key aspect that we are still struggling now, because we know that they have many diseases.
Yeah.
We can make a survey to have a baseline, but then what? I mean, you know clearly that we have a traceability in the whole animals in our country. So, but we need to find some innovation that could help us to monitor the evolution of the animal health.
Yeah. So we come back to Gilles. Animal health, and thinking about in dairy cattle, simple things, I guess, like mastitis would cause productivity loss and so on. Is that a focus for IDF to work on animal health?
Absolutely. This is one of the key areas, and when you look at animal health, I think it starts, as I mentioned in another panel, it really starts with the calf, and the management, because the key at the it's farm management and how the husbandry practices you have on the farm. So ensuring that the calf has access to colostrum, grows strong, and so on. You talk about mastitis. Other health is critical. I mean, if you can reduce the incidence of mastitis, you really avoid not only cows being sick and milk being not usable and methane still being produced while the milk is not used. So you have, and of course, you want to avoid disease outbreaks. Because if you have an outbreak and the herd, not only one or two cow, but the whole herd has a problem, then you get into more wasted product and less opportunity to reduce the footprint. Maybe I want to make a bridge on some of the other issues you mentioned. We're watching very closely. Some of the stuff that's being that you mentioned, like for example, a vaccine, development of a vaccine that would help mitigate the methane emission. Genetics. We have CMEX in Canada that has done a lot of analysis, and they actually won a prize in Chicago at the Dairy Innovation, and they have sequenced milk sample, and they're starting to look at genetic selection that will over time hopefully bring reduction to methane. So there's various ways of it's not, like I said, it's not one size fit all, and there's various ways of various technology that can be used. You mentioned feed additive, of course, is an important one. So there's many that can be used, and the cost will vary, and the uptake will vary depending on the region, on the market that's out there too.
Yeah.
And that's going to be the big key. Is there an incentive, as we said before, to have this conversion and put these practices in place so that there's good value at the end to do that for the farmers?
So I should have mentioned earlier on when Gonzalo mentioned the Uruguayan target to reduce intensity of emissions by 35% by 2030, right? So GRSB, the Global Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, we have a similar intensity target reduction of 30% by 2030 on a pathway to neutrality. And the reason we say pathway and don't give that a date is because we don't know how we're going to get there yet. And seriously, we have to work on that, and there was no point in setting a target which we did not know how we were going to get there. But one of the contributions I think that we can definitely look to in the beef industry is the dairy industry. Beef on dairy genetics and making more use of those dairy calves into the beef supply chain. Obviously, they're already there, but we can definitely improve that. And the use of other technologies, breeding and genetics, can really accelerate that. Does any of you want to talk about that? I mean,
We're kind of talking Uruguay. We have a national program of genetics to increase the efficiency of the animals, and to reduce the intensity of emissions. So it's not in Angus, it's in Hereford.
yeah.
but we have a program in Uruguay. It's a combination in between the Association of Hereford in Uruguay and the National Research Institute. When they qualified the bulls, the new bulls, they taste. They have some tasted up to take into consideration is also in the EPD,
Right.
also the conversion of the feed into product. So in a way to find a way to select the animals that they are more efficient than others, and because we know that we have a high heredability of that condition, so we are trying to make it increasing. The issue there, I mean, because also they reduce the intensity of emissions, but the issue there is how to scale it.
Right.
So we have some good results, but we are start seeing how we can scale it to their whole.
Yeah. And another quite, I mean, it's not simple, but it's perfectly possible now, is sex semen. And in India, I understand there's been quite a big uptake of sex semen because really they're not a beef consuming country. They do export a significant amount of meat, but they want female calves so that they can continue to produce milk. So that's a big thing there. But for the beef industry, it could work the other way around. And if we get offspring from the dairy industry, there's no supporting emissions. So hold in the middle. So if we're getting progeny from the dairy industry, we get a massive saving right at the beginning of that animal's life. And to us, we could actually meet most of our commitment to reduce emissions simply by going really far into beef on dairy where that's possible.
I think I've just sorted out how to solve emissions for the dairy industry. Then we charge beef for all of our emissions. Is that how we do it, Rory?
No,
so,
I don't think that
so
would
I think
work.
game over. Anyway, I did want to make a couple of comments on the previous discussion. 2 weeks ago, I mentioned I was in Nairobi for this carbon market work, and ILRI has got the most amazing research center there where they have the only chambers in Africa where you can put. They've got them for both large ruminants like cows, and then they've also got them for small ruminants, sheep and goats. And the work they are doing, analyzing methane reductions from different feed types, different cow genetics, etc., is really world class, and huge credit to ILRI for the work they're doing. Then you've got other genetics type companies in the US and in New Zealand who are members of ours, and they're all working on this question about what are the genetic strains that result in lower methane emissions. We know not all cows have got the same emissions profile, so there's a lot of work going on in genetics, and this is all about mitigation, right?
Yep.
But at the same time, those companies are all working on adaptation. How can we have cattle that are more resilient to increased temperature, bugs, etc., etc. And so some of the work that's going on in the genetic space is really, really, I think it's certainly going to take us a long way down the path. Last thing I wanted to say was just coming back on this whole question about technologies versus practice. When we started the Pathways to Dairy Net Zero program, we worked very closely with the Global Research Alliance on Agricultural Greenhouse Gases. And GRA came to us and they said there is a 40% emissions reduction potential in the dairy sector globally by implementing good practice everywhere. And I don't care whether you're in the Netherlands or Denmark or the United States or you're in Ethiopia. If you plot your dairy farms on a normal distribution, you will find farms that are performing at the best of the best, and you'll find a lot of farms that are underperforming, in a normal distribution, even in the US. And I think you made this point before too, Katie, moving them up to, a sort of good performance will significantly reduce our emissions. So 40% by practice change, a further 35% potential of the technologies we have today. Now that's before we get into technologies like methane vaccines, etc. But the problem with the 35% is that it doesn't always pay for itself, which is really the question we're getting with Bovaer and methane digesters, etc. But that first 40% does pay for itself. So, if you can reduce emissions by 40%, improve your yield at the same time, you get a double whammy if we can find a way to access carbon markets for those small holders. And just this question of in value chain versus voluntary markets. If you go to a development bank in East Africa and you ask for money to get into cashew nuts for export or coffee or pistachios or some other export crop, there is no difficulty in getting the funding. The challenge in those emerging markets is with dairy, it is a very local value chain. It's not an export crop. And so the way we've been thinking about carbon markets for those emerging economies is we can't export the dairy from them, but we might be able to, in inverted commas, export the reductions in emissions by selling those outside in a voluntary carbon market, therefore bringing export earnings into those economies to help with the transformation of the dairy sector. This Pathways program, we have sort of an objective to raise around $100 million per country for these emerging countries that we're working with. That will scratch the surface of transformation. We see carbon markets as really the long-term economic engine to drive them.
Great.
I just had one quick comment that I wanted to make sure I was advocating for the farmer here on some of this. As we've talked about some of the interventions, right, have the co-benefits, have the productivity, and we can do them, and they absolutely pay for themselves. I think the one part we need to recognize, though, is that data transfer and the work involved on the farmer base to actually get that data in a way and then pass it to the food companies. And so while we may not need to be paying for the reduction that's happening on farm, we do need to make sure that we are getting the proper incentives for farmers for supplying good quality, verifiable data.
Yeah.
And that's part of, I think, the voluntary carbon market that we're actually seeing on the beef side. It's less around necessarily paying for the mitigation intervention. It's more around paying for how do we make sure they're giving us the data, they're putting it in a manner that allows it to be very transparent, very credible, very verifiable, and then allowing those third-party verification to happen on farm. So I think even as we think about those, how do we make sure if it's not an incentive on the actual carbon reduction, there's an incentive around that data capture? Because I think, to me, honestly, that's the hardest part about this is getting the data from the farmers. I mean, my dad actually is a purebred producer, and it's all in a notebook. It's not on a computer. And I think, especially start going into some of these emerging markets, it's probably not even in a notebook. And so getting the data, I think, is going to be the next part as we think about carbon markets, or just the transfer of that information in general will be critical.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks for that. It's an important reminder. And I guess one of the concerns that I can envisage coming up in the next few years, because we've seen just in the last couple of years a multiplicity of new tools for people. And if we end up with so many different tools, we need everything to work together. And so the more tools we have, the more complicated it's going to be to make sure that we can actually, use data across platforms. So that's something to just bear in mind. I do want to give the audience a chance to ask questions or make a comment, and then we'll wrap up with a couple of final things. We've got a question over there. Do we have another microphone?
Excellent session. I had 2 questions. So I'm Umang Agarwal. I head the carbon program for Grow Indigo in India. We do land-based carbon programs. So one of the things that comes up, particularly from the buyers of carbon credits, is this whole debate around reductions versus removals, right? And so ideally the CCP labels and all should so basically you get a premium for removals compared to reduction. So any comments? Because reductions are, as we are seeing, more complex, particularly in dairy. So that is first question, and if I can also put the second question, is around more on the measurement and monitoring side. So how scalable is it? Do you have to monitor every cattle eating that particular supplement, or is it on a sample basis? And
Yeah, okay, Gonzalo, I'll give you the microphone. You can answer the reductions versus removal thing. Oh, sorry. And I thought you'd like that. And then I'd like to also, maybe you could touch on permanence, because removals, that there is the issue of permanence, right? Wow. I'm giving you all the easy stuff today. I'm giving you all the easy things today.
Yeah, yes, I know. Thank you. Yeah. Yes, they are. I mean, as you said, they are completely different things, but I think that in the credit, you can take both. I mean, at least you can show the additionality of what the practice that you are doing. Both they are available to show. So we have some examples in Uruguay in agro-pastoralist systems where you have a sink of carbon that you are reducing and you are capturing in the forest, so that can apply. But also we have examples that they are testing. I mean, we have some with additives also that we are using in Uruguay. They have some complexity because you have registration in the country. It's not just the product; you have the registration in the country to apply it, and we are trying to work also in some others that they are in rice now. Perhaps for India will be work because the rice we have complete irrigation in Uruguay, but there are new technologies that can take less water, so they can reduce the methane. So, what I think that is the one that they are the thing of the carbon is more complex to prove it in the long term, rather than the other ones that there are possibilities of reduction that is more feasible to get the carbon credit, rather than the other one that you need to prove it. You need to monitor the soil, monitor the tree that is there. So that's the complexity between the both.
Okay, thanks. Mohammed? I have a couple more, yeah, and then we'll have to wrap up.
I have a question. The whole concept about having carbon neutrality in the beef is based on the removals, of course, reducing emissions with the additives you have, etc. What will happen when you reach an equilibrium point in terms of removals, which we've seen already between 10 to 15 years, and long-term sustainability of that?
Yep, that's an excellent question. And Gonzalo's
Thank you.
back on the hot seat.
Yeah, well, that's an issue. That's an issue. I think that it depends in the process of certification that you put in practice, no? Because you have some protocols that you need to follow. If you go to the APCC, if you want to go to APCC guidelines, you need to taste. You need data for 20 years. If you want to prove that you have a sink of carbon of that process. So what we saw in Uruguay, that is probably the best way to prove the carbon neutrality is it's mainly with the trees. It's the best way because
Which you know very well.
we have some other research in the soil, in natural pasture. We have some data, but you need to prove it, and it's more difficult in the protocol to prove.
I'm former president of IDF. It's just two considerations about Gilles. You said rightly that these carbon credits should stay inside our chain, because we have a lot to compensate at the processing level and distribution level. But I have a question, practical question, and another consideration is about the methodologies that should be global and harmonized and just aligned. A question, practical question, is to you, Donald. I don't know if exists any research about the potential in terms of quantity of CO2 that is potentially create credits at farm level to transfer to the processing and distribution level. There is any estimation about what is the potential, not just in terms of value, but in terms of quantity of CO2?
Yeah, we do have some numbers. I just don't have them in my head, unfortunately, Pier Cristiano. I converted them into, if you divide that 4.5 billion by 50, you'll get to the size of the potential in Africa in terms of the number of tons of CO2 equivalent per annum that we can reduce. I have got some numbers, so if you want to look at them, we can go through them later. But I think to your first point about, we want to retain the credits within the value chain. I think we've got to be realistic here. The credits are going to be owned by the farmers, not by the value chain. So if we're going to retain it within the value chain, we have to be able to make sure that we are valorizing them within the value chain in such a way that we can afford to pay them. Otherwise, the farmers, we shouldn't be holding them back from selling them, right? This is ultimately an asset the farmer has. And my point before about those emerging markets is there is not the formalization of the value chain in a lot of those emerging or developing markets that are looking at trying to retain credits within them. So at the moment, we're doing nothing with them. That's why maybe entering into, voluntary markets is the best way to reward the farmers. And as I said before, use that money that then comes in as a way to further enhance and develop the dairy value chain or the beef value chain or whatever it might be in those emerging or developing markets.
Great. We have to wrap up, but I just want to ask very quickly of Katie, and we'll see if anybody else wants to chip in. Where do you see this in 5 or 10 years? Are we going to have a functioning market that is rewarding farmers appropriately?
My crystal ball. I think there will be, right? So I think the question of exactly when, how, and where, what does that look like? I don't know, right? I would tell you that there's multiple different, shots on goal and avenues that we're pursuing right now to see what ultimately sticks. But I think if we think about how do we want to achieve these goals and what does that look like, waiting for global frameworks, global governments, I think those are great. There's things that we need, but there's an opportunity for us to continue to move right now and parallel process it. And I think it's the voluntary carbon market that's going to allow that. I interact a lot with the food companies and processors. Like they want to make progress. They want to have movement on that. And so I think the voluntary carbon markets and having different iterations. I'm a capitalist, so I think there should be different options for our producers to say, is it Athian? Is it another platform? Is there offset marketplaces to participate in? It's their asset to sell, but I think the opportunity is there, and I think there'll be multiple solutions in the next 5 years, and then you start going to 10 years and there's more global frameworks and things like that, it'll start to streamline to likely a few main players.
Great. Well, thanks everybody for that. Is anybody, you want to chip in there, Gonzalo? Everybody does. They all get a last crack at the whip.
Part of your answer is the 6.2. I mean, because it's going to depend on what we decide under the UNFCCC. If what's going to happen with those carbon credits, if you will take into account in the national inventories or not. So, because we have this carbon, but if at the end they sell it, you need to reduce it from your inventory. So then it's come all the governments saying, well, if they are losing all my carbon credits, how we are going to show my objectives or achieve my objectives in the NDCs? So it's not so easy.
Gilles first, and then Donald.
Yeah, I think, and to Donald's point, I think when we look at this is really the million or $billion question. How do we create value for the improvement that will happen on the farm, and how do we do that in a way that we will be able, ideally, to keep them within the chain. But we need the value. We need to be able to create that value that will be there. Otherwise, if it's all voluntary and it leaves the sector, and when they come to me, I'm a dairy processor, they come to me and they say, I want to know exactly the footprint of that kilo of cheese. If part of it has been, if my farmers has sold it somewhere else, how am I going to account for that? I'm going to have to say, well, my cheese is not sustainable anymore, maybe. So that's going to be, I think that's going to be the real challenge, is to create that value and compete for that value, and making sure that hopefully we reward appropriately, but at the same time we can promote. Otherwise, in my view, we're shooting ourselves in the foot. We're going to have a regressive dairy and beef industry, maybe.
Yeah, you can imagine the day, can't you, Gilles, where, we get on our airplane, we fly to London, we get off the airplane in London, feeling good about ourselves because that airline was carbon neutral because they'd bought offsets from the dairy industry, and you walk past a Starbucks and you're reviled at the thought of drinking a cafe latte because it's got this horrible, bad performing, component in it. I mean, you can imagine that happening. I can't help but wonder to myself whether in the next decade or so we're going to see a sea change of thinking happen in carbon markets again, because the only, as you said at the beginning, Rory, the only opportunity we have for removals is agriculture, forestry, and oceans, right? Those are the only opportunities for removals until such time as we get direct capture technology, etc. So why are we setting agriculture up to compete with airlines and with, Mobil Oil and others who are always going to be able, and Microsoft, who are always going to be able to pay more for carbon credit than maybe we can in the food system because our margins are so tight. So I think ultimately there may need to be what I would think of as a come to Jesus moment where we need to rethink what's going on there, and that might happen in the next decade or two. But in the meantime, we're down this rabbit hole on carbon markets, and I think there's an opportunity for us to find ways to continue to unlock it. But I do think there might be a rethinking, a reset at some point, particularly if SBTI and the GHGP start to allow you to use offsets on Scope 3 emissions. Then the price is going to start going up. So it's my last thought on it.
Thanks, Donald. Shouldn't that be a come to Krishna moment? Anyway, thanks to everybody for your contributions today and for the audience for coming. I'm sure you got more questions. They're all around, so call them in the corridors if you have further questions. Thank you for coming.